Okay, done. To the agenda. It's a fairly standard agenda tonight. We have our speaker, Matt Smith, here, ready to present. Then after the presentation and associated Q&A, we'll move on to some general business. Fairly simple. So for the Zoomers out there, first of all, a reminder to please mute your microphones if not already done so. We can hear any background noise from your place. During the presentation, I ask you all to keep your microphones muted. For the Q&A session, I think you know the rules. You can raise your hand virtually or put something in the chat line that you want to ask a question, or you can put the question in the chat and the host will read it out for the speaker. Please mute your microphone after asking a question. For those here in the audience, please raise your hand if you want to ask a question, and I will probably ask you to come up to the front here so that you can speak into this microphone and it can be heard by the Zoomers out there. So be aware of that, and then we can take it from there. So to our speaker tonight, Matt Smith is a UNSW postgraduate and one of OFF's 2024 research grant recipients. As part of his PhD studies, Matt is investigating if and how kangaroo populations impact vegetation, invertebrates, birds, reptiles and mammals throughout Australia's arid zone, and how this impacts biodiversity conservation outcomes. In particular, he's addressing the concern that excessive grazing by kangaroos may adversely affect arid zone biodiversity. At present, there is little scientific data concerning kangaroos' impacts on ecosystems in arid Australia. The objective of this project is to investigate whether kangaroo grazing does in fact affect thick-billed grasswrens populations at Nature Foundation's Witchelina Reserve in the northern region of South Australia. And I know a number of our audience have been up to the northern part of South Australia and maybe came across the Witchelina Reserve. It's all well beyond Arkaroola and points north, but not quite into the Northern Territory. So interesting place. It's certainly arid country though. So with that brief introduction, I'll hand over to Matt to tell us all about his project. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you very much. Speaking with someone. Thanks everybody. Thanks for having me here today. I'm really appreciative of the support that Oakley Forum for Foundation has given me to purchase some camera traps that I did my study with, and I'll just jump to the chase and say that the data we got with them was a raging success. We've had a number of setbacks, but the camera trap data has worked really well. So just a bit about me. I'm studying at UNSW here in Sydney, but I grew up in Swan Hill on the Murray River. I was very fortunate to have parents who love nature and love wildlife, planted a lot of trees when I was growing up, and that was able to connect with the birds and the mammals and everything that came in. And also living on the Murray is a great spot to get down the river, go fishing, go camping. So I've been really lucky to, in my junior life, be able to connect with the Aussie bush. And now my studies, I'm very, very thankful, feel like I'm living the dream. I've worked at a number of different ecosystems, from the Snowies up in the Kosciuszko region. Just last week I was down up Smiths Lake. This study that I'm doing out in the arid zone and several other places. So I'll just start off with this works. Here we go. Sorry. Sorry, just click through. First slide. The one? Yep. Oh, sorry, I didn't realize I was clicking through. Thanks. So I'd just like to start off with this photo. This is of Witchelina, where the study was conducted. So down the bottom we can see Pug Hut, and this is where we camped out and we go out there. In the background is Termination Hill, which is a sacred site for the local Indigenous traditional owners. I just want to put this photo up so you guys can get a bit of an understanding and see what the landscape's like. It's really marginal country, really tough. Not very much vegetation cover. Not very much vegetation cover, and it can really be impacted through cycles of drought and really intense rain. So Witchelina was formerly a sheep grazing station, as well as most of the land out there, but millions and millions and millions of hectares are now being managed for conservation in this region. So I just want to point out that the ecological processes and the plants and animals I'm going to talk about today and the conservation issues surrounding them, these are direct and really important topics that a lot of people are working on directly. So the funding that you guys are giving me to produce this science is going to be directly helping conservation on these properties. Right, now I'm where I want to be. Sorry. So just an overview of how I want to structure tonight's talk. It's not often that I have to convince people that it's worth conserving species like the thick-billed grasswren, but the issue of whether or not kangaroos are a problem out in the arid zone is a lot more contentious, and I'm sure there's a lot of different opinions in the audience today. So I just sort of want to set the scene a little bit and talk through some of the reasons why we're concerned, and we want to be looking at whether or not kangaroos are having an impact. And then I'll move on to thick-billed grasswrens in particular, why we think they might potentially be impacted by kangaroo grazing, some of our results that we've got so far, and some really promising future directions that we're looking at. So this is a little bit of a scratchy photo that I had to pull from a not so old paper, but this is just showing approximately when pastoralism reached different parts of Australia. And I just want to point out that even in the most central, arid, hard to get to places, even since as far back as the 1850s, there's been land modification so that we could grow, so we could raise sheep and cattle for feeding purposes. So approaching almost 2 decades soon, 2 centuries, there's been a lot of habitat change, land management change, and this is, as we are all aware, has caused a lot of issues when it comes to biodiversity conservation. So just to highlight this is a
Zoomers can't see the side.
Oh, sure.
They're not moving for some reason.
No worries.
There's no working here.
Different things that are impacting biodiversity and change. But I just want to point out this study by David Aldridge and others looked at basically all the data that was published in Australia on the arid lands of Australia, looking at the impacts of cattle grazing on a few different metrics. So when we look at structure, we're thinking of how much plant density there is, the plant cover patchiness, if they're small patches of grass or large patches. With the function, we're looking at things like nutrient cycling, how well the landscape can provide as much energy and resources for animals when there's rain. And basically, just the takeaway from this is the further to the right, left you guys are looking at, the worse off it is. So it's not news to anyone, but I'll just come back to that later. But some of these things can recover if you take livestock off. So this is some satellite imagery measurements of different coverage, vegetation coverage at a place called Bonbon. It's a Bush Heritage Run site in the arid rangelands in South Australia. And it's not quite showing up here on the screen, but in 2008, these guys destocked. And they've looked at the changes in bare soil cover. So obviously you expect high bare soil cover where there's overgrazing. MPV, which is non-photosynthetic vegetation cover, and photosynthetic vegetation cover. And the main takeaway from this, particularly when we look at the bare soil, once they destock, there's a clear difference between Bonbon, which is the solid line, and the next door neighbours, which is the dotted line, sort of moving forward from there. So there's less bare soil cover, more vegetation cover. and also more non-photosynthetic vegetation cover. That trend also switching where there's more on bonbon, where they're destocked, and these are really important for some of those structure and those function metrics that I was talking about in the previous slide. And so there's other partial activities other than just putting stock on the land that have had negative impacts. So this is an image of just an example of how artificial water points have percolated through the arid zone through the years. So as you can see, each black dot there is either a dam or a bore or somewhere where water's been diverted to water stock. And as you can see, from 1947 to 1999, there was a real increase. And this is just sort of an example of these processes that have been happening through the arid zone. So if we think about way back when there was only a few water points for stock, this is also a period of time when stocking rates were much higher than they were now because there wasn't the same understanding of sustainable grazing pressure. It's also harder to manage that grazing pressure because if drought hit, these days we can put stock on a truck and move them to greener pastures, where back then they would have had to walk them to the nearest train. And so what we see now is legacy effects, where there would have been higher grazing pressure around these water points, and we still see hundreds of years later that these areas are more degraded than other areas nearby. So these effects from back in the early 1900s are still impacting biodiversity now. And of course, the other impact that introducing extra water into landscape is it gives it a competitive advantage to feral animals. So rabbits are obviously a classic one in the arid zone. This is a photo from Mixo trials way back when, but it just sort of highlights that as we put more and more water points that are more and more persistent, we're changing this landscape and we're giving feral animals such as rabbits that are really harmful and really detrimental to biodiversity conservation a leg up. And obviously, cats and foxes are eating lots and lots of native animals. And due to all these pressures, as I'm sure you're all aware, there's been significant biodiversity decline throughout the arid zone. So this figure presented by Leg and others in 2023 just sort of highlights how throughout desert areas, so central Australia, there's been a really high number of extinctions relative to other areas. So places like Witchelina are obviously really important because we're starting to try to reverse some of these effects. And it's not just groups like Nature Foundation, there's a lot of stakeholders. There's government agencies, so National Parks of New South Wales, who obviously work out in western areas of the state, and South Australia. Every state that has arid zones is obviously managing it through government properties. There's the NGOs such as Nature Foundation and Bush Heritage, who I mentioned earlier. And it's also really important to remember that private landholders are major conservation stakeholders as well. So, for instance, in New South Wales, the Biodiversity Conservation Trust, they'll get farmers, they'll pay them to manage part of their land for biodiversity, and that might include destocking, but also managing kangaroos under the assumption that they're going to be detrimental to biodiversity, which I'll touch on more later. There's also Indigenous groups, Indigenous landholders, and also just pastoralists who think it's important to be good stewards of the land and make sure that species aren't going extinct on their watch. So there's a lot of very interested stakeholders that are looking at the research that we're doing. So one of the problems, however, when you move from a pastoral station or some sort of agriculture to a conservation is that you still have problems with those persistent wild herbivores even once you destock. And just to highlight, this isn't just an Australian problem; it's a worldwide problem. These are a few examples. So reindeer in the Yamal region of Russia are overgrazing on moss, and they're changing the structure and the functioning of those habitats. Everyone knows about the elk at Yellowstone and the wolves, how that can, when they become overpopulated and without predators, can potentially change ecosystems. And this little guy here in the middle is a white-lipped pig from the Central America and South America. And when they're overpopulated, they can actually eat 98% of seeds that are seeded to revegetate forests, and have been a major contribution to those restoration projects not succeeding. So I just wanted to highlight that we're talking about obviously a native Australian animal today, but it's a problem that is worldwide. So as I said, there's concerns from a number of stakeholders that that kangaroos might be overgrazing landscapes. Pastoralists have made it clear that they're out there, they can see the effects. They've highlighted that kangaroos are a major reason contributing to grazing pressure and sustainable grazing pressure. And this has been also backed up by a sentiment that's been reflected by a number of ecologists and wildlife scientists, people working in the industry and actively working to manage wildlife conservation. And this really became apparent sort of in the later half of the past decade. From 2010 onwards, there was a reasonable amount of rainfall throughout Australia's arid zone. So this is some data I pulled from the northwest pastoral zone of South Australia. And so at the top we have rainfall. You can see that from 2010 sort of through to 2017, there was periods of pretty high rainfall, consistent rainfall, and vegetation cover remained quite high throughout this period. As this occurred, the kangaroos sort of recovered from the millennial drought where their numbers really crashed. And they climbed quite high, as you can see, a really consistent climb year after year as vegetation cover remained the same, and they sort of caught up, their populations caught up with the carrying capacity, how much the landscape could sort of support them. Then in 2018, 2019, it essentially stopped raining. Some spots in the region got about 40 mil per year over that 2-year period. And as you can see, the vegetation cover dropped dramatically, and there was an incredible decline in the kangaroo numbers. And this had a number of issues, not just ecological, but also from a human welfare problem. There's a lot of people reported increases in depression because they were driving along the road seeing en masse kangaroos starving, a lot of having to put them down, put them out of the misery. Here's an article showing a lady pulling dead kangaroos that have got stuck in bogs, looking for the last water they could find. And on the right, some friends and colleagues of mine out at Fowler's Gap, they were doing small mammal trapping at this period of time. And they drove past this common wallaroo. It's a relative, an arid zone relative of kangaroos. And it was actually scavenging for a number of days on a dead kangaroo, because essentially by this point there was no vegetation cover left, and the only nutrients it could find was in one of its dead, another dead kangaroo. I believe it started off eating stomach contents, but moved on to flesh when that was all gone. So it's obviously a major concern from not only the ecological, but from an animal welfare and a human welfare point of view, when we have situations where these native animals get to what could potentially be unsustainable levels, overgraze the landscape, and then die off en masse. But the next logical question to ask is, isn't this natural? These arid landscapes, they have boom and bust cycles where there's incredible amounts of rain, lots of life, lots of growth, and then obviously that rainfall declines and we have incredible droughts. And so isn't this natural boom and bust cycle where these kangaroo populations get really high and then crash all of a sudden natural? We can get some hints by looking across the dingo fence in south that runs from up in Queensland right along the Queensland-New South Wales border and then down across to the border in WA. So north of the dingo fence, there's obviously dingo populations haven't been completely extirpated and they can predate on kangaroos. Whereas inside the dingo fence, there's really not much predation on kangaroos. There are culling quotas, but they're rarely met. And so just to sort of highlight the difference in how this affects kangaroo populations, this graph is looking at red kangaroo densities inside in the open white dots, and as you can see, their numbers are a lot higher, but they're also a lot more variable. Whereas outside the dingo fence where they're predating on dingoes, there's a consistently lower number of kangaroos, but their numbers fluctuate less in terms with environmental variability. So we don't see these huge increases and we don't see these huge declines. So following the drought, it was evident that there wasn't a whole heap. There was these assumptions that kangaroos were overgrazing the landscape and being really detrimental to biodiversity conservation, but it was evident that there also wasn't a lot of data to support this. So a lot of the traditional data looking at kangaroos was really asking how do they compete with livestock for feed. So these are just some examples of the classic sort of kangaroo studies that were done in the early days. Looking at on the left here, we've got sort of how their diets compared to sheep, and then on the right, sort of how much are they eating. So Terry Dawson and others over here looking to see that kangaroos are sort of preferencing grasses over shrubs, and that there was a bit of a difference between kangaroos, goats, and sheep and what they're eating. And over on the other side, they're just trying to work out, when there's lots of feed, how much are they eating? When there's not much feed, how much are they eating? Very interesting if you're trying to make a living and understand how kangaroos might impact your business as a pastoralist. But when it comes to understanding what ecological effect they might have, it's not as informative. So there's been some recent, so since the drought and sort of the lead up there, there's been some really interesting studies come out that start to give us some insight into this. So on the left, these photos are from a paper published by Charlotte Mills and others, where they looked at vegetation cover, structure, inside and outside of kangaroo grazed, rabbit grazed, and control plots. So just sort of trying to work out the relative differences between the different herbivores. You can see from the photos up here that where the rabbits were excluded, the kangaroos could get in. Yeah, there's some vegetation cover compared to where it's grazed, but still not heaps. But if we look at the all exclusion and the kangaroo exclusion, you can really see the difference in how much more vegetation cover there is inside and outside. So that's going to be really important for a number of reasons. It's going to increase soil retention, so we won't have erosion. There'll be more habitat for species. There'll be more resources available for species. And on the right-hand side are some graphs looking at similar exposures from Jessica Brandon. And this is looking on the left-hand side at the soil density. So when we look at the control where kangaroos can move through and where kangaroos are excluded, the soil is a lot more dense where kangaroos are moving around. So the kangaroos are compacting the soil. And then if we look over at the next graph where we see the opposite trend, that's looking at water infiltration. So this is really important in the arid zone because when it rains, the soil really needs to take up as much water as it can so that all the vegetation can grow and it can create as much resources to support biodiversity. And as you can see, there's considerably less water infiltration where kangaroos could graze freely versus where they couldn't. So the soil compaction appears to be, having these impacts on how the ecosystem's functioning, and these we expect to have flow-on effects. So some of these flow-on effects have been observed and measured in the resources that may be available for other species. So these photos on the left were from a study published by James Rees, where he looked at how kangaroos might impact seed availability. So there's one of these kangaroo exposures up the top, and as you can see, there's a lot of more vegetation growing. This is a native daisy in there that's feed for a number of different species out in the arid zone. Whereas down the bottom, you can see it's been heavily grazed. This is on a conservation reserve where sheep and cattle have been removed, and the main grazer was kangaroos. And these graphs, they're not showing up fantastic here, but basically they're just showing how much there's an extreme difference down here is control where kangaroos can graze, whereas the exposure where they can't, the amount of biomass, vegetation biomass, is considerably higher, as is the amount of seed heads, grass seed heads. And so these guys hypothesised that when kangaroos overgraze this landscape, they significantly reduce the amount of resources that can be available for, say, other granivores, such as native mice, or other herbivores. It's not only these sort of like living vegetation and stuff that feeds on living vegetation that's been observed in. It's also been observed in termites and stuff that breaks down dead vegetation matter. So this is some data published by Baptiste Witjaz recently, and he was looking at the amount of dead vegetation cover inside and outside of kangaroo exclosures, and also the amount of termite activity. And basically what he found is along a rainfall gradient, as rainfall increases and there's more vegetation growth, where the kangaroos were excluded, the accumulation of dead vegetation was significantly higher than outside. And he also found that as that occurred, the amount of termite activity increased significantly. And that's important because this is, as I was saying before, nutrient cycling is like a key foundation of a healthy ecosystem. So this is showing how when the grazing pressure is removed, some of these processes can become more and more intense. And these impacts from how kangaroo grazing may impact simple ecosystem functions and how that flows on through to the resources that are available have also been measured in having biodiversity impacts on other mammal and bird species. So this graph on the left is from Bulkamata Station, one of the stations I work at. And each year they'll conduct an annual bird survey. So this is bird surveys of different bird species in these bar graphs. And as you can see, the kangaroo densities below, the kangaroo densities of this solid line, the amount of birds that they found in their bird surveys really followed how much rainfall there'd been. Whereas when the kangaroo grazing got more intense, the response from birds to rainfall became decoupled, potentially because the kangaroos were reducing, say, the seed availability or the habitat availability, and this is making the landscape less able to support these species. And on the right-hand side, again, we've got Baptiste, where he followed on and he looked at how much the abundances of different species that might feed on termites inside and outside of these had kangaroo exclosures. Basically, what you can see, the grey bars aren't showing up too great, but these are termite feeding species, so such as this striped-faced darner, photo above here. These are species that feed on termites, and these are the species that sort of persist through drought when dead vegetation and termites are the only sort of animals that are, or the only food source that are available to support these food chains. And what he found is that where kangaroo grazing was excluded, they were in significantly higher abundance. So over the last few years, there's sort of been this chain of evidence starting to grow that when we remove kangaroo grazing, particularly when it got to the extreme levels that it did prior to the drought, we start to see some better ecosystem functioning. So, like I was saying, the water filtration, soil density, that speaks back to some of the things that we're trying to fix by removing cattle and sheep from the landscape. It's also that's having a flow-on effect and affecting the resources that are available for species, and we're measuring now declines or increases in species where kangaroos grazing is managed or removed. So that brings us on to the thick-billed grasswrens and why we might think that thick-billed grasswrens could be impacted by kangaroo grazing. So this is a graph of the thick-billed grasswren sort of predicted habitat today, or a map, sorry. There's three main subspecies in isolated patches. There's one subspecies way out in WA in Shark Bay. There's the mild subspecies down in the Gawler Ranges, and then the subspecies I'm working up that's sort of located north from these ranges. So for our northern Flinders ranges and our Gawler range subspecies, they're in areas that where sheep grazing still occurs, and uh, as a result, dingoes have been extirpated from the landscape, and kangaroo numbers can periodically reach those hyperabundances I was sort of talking about earlier. So they're in that area where we might be concerned that periodically the kangaroos will get to a point where they're affecting some sort of resource or some important habitat characteristic that will be important for these guys' population. So this is the subspecies I'm working in. I just wanted to point out that some of the lines aren't coming out too great on this projector, but the dingo fence, where we keep the dingoes outside and kangaroo numbers really explode on the inside. It comes up around this corner of Witchelina, which is this sort of area here. So this is an image of typical thick-billed grasswren habitat. They rely heavily on these dense canopod shrublands. They particularly particularly found in so saltbush and blackbush, as well as bluebush areas. And this isn't necessarily a major concern as far as it comes to kangaroo grazing, because as some of that foundational kangaroo diet analysis showed, canopods aren't a huge part of their diet, but they do become a part of their diet as all the other feed moves away, and these sort of perennial shrubs are the last sort of vegetative food that they can access. So there's a potential that during extreme drought, they may be feeding on important habitat and reducing the habitat suitability for the thick-billed grasswrens. They could also be impacting the food availability for thick-billed grasswrens. So thick-billed grasswrens are generalist feeders. They can feed on seeds when they're foraging along the ground, as well as fruits from different plants. They also eat a number of different insects. So there's reports of them eating termites, but people who have observed feeding behaviours, particularly at nests with chicks, have seen them feeding grasshoppers, caterpillars, a number of different invertebrates. So we can expect if ground cover has been impacted, if productivity has been impacted, if different resources are important for these invertebrates, such as vegetation or dead vegetation has been impacted by overgrazing by kangaroos, that we could see a reduction in thick-billed grasswren populations as a response to reduced food availability. And so, just to highlight why we thought this was a problem and why it's important that we look at thick-billed grasswrens. This is some monitoring data from Witchelina over a 10-year period starting in 2010. This black line is sort of the curve, it's basically the trend line for this period for thick-billed grasswren. So it started off really well in 2010. Sorry, you can't quite see it. Too bad the axis, but started off really high numbers in 2010 with a rapid decline as rainfall declined through to 2013. Then when that rainfall sort of increased again, like we saw in the Bulkamata bird data, there wasn't that same response to the increased rainfall where the population recovered. And it got to the point where they were getting less than one thick-billed grasswren per 100 kilometres of bird survey. So there was major concern that they become locally extinct. And like we saw with the bird data of Bulkamata, this was during a period where kangaroo numbers were booming before the drought. So there's concern. People working out there hypothesise that one of the reasons that this may have been due to kangaroo grazing. So now for these properties out in these habitats, managing kangaroos is one of their priorities, despite the fact that, as I highlighted, there's only really recently been a number of studies come out sort of looking at if and how they may be a problem. And when it comes to the thick-billed grasswren, there hasn't yet been any studies sort of looking at whether or not kangaroos are in fact impacting any important things that are helping them persist in this landscape. So it's really important for these conservation organisations that we really start to understand some of the mechanisms that kangaroo grazing, if and how they are impacting, so that they can not only have effective kangaroo management plans, but also making sure it's ethical and science-based. So like I said, we want to try and work out whether or not kangaroo grazing impacts the habitat, impacts the food availability. Potentially there's an indirect effect where kangaroos are impacting the vegetation, and that's impacting food availability for the thick-billed grasswren. So as I mentioned already, the study site was out at Witchelina, so that description of it before, but as you can see up here, it's just right at the top of the Northern Flinders Ranges, just below Murray, for anyone that knows the region. The experimental study that we were working around was within 3 paired sites. Each had a 16-hectare fenced area that was excluding kangaroos, and we had an associated control area where they could graze freely. And just to show you what these sites look like, this is an image of a newly finished kangaroo exposure. This one was finished in March of 2024. So they're 400 and 400 metres. And as you can see, it's really tough marginal country, not a lot of cover. The thick-billed grasswrens are moving around in between these bushes. You might be able to see these echinopods. So it's really not like it's super intact, really robust habitat. It's clearly very vulnerable and needs to be actively managed. So to understand what kangaroos are doing at our study site, understand how they're impacting vegetation, how they might be impacting food availability for thick-billed grasswren, we did a number of different data collection methods. One of the funnest is always spotlighting, where we drive around at night counting kangaroos. That's just to get a good background data, because it's important to know any differences that we might find between kangaroo grazed and ungrazed. It's important to have a background understanding of whether or not there are a lot of kangaroos in the landscape, or whether what we're seeing might be something else. We did vegetation transects to understand the species composition and sort of vegetation types that are inside and outside the exclosures. So, for instance, there's a photo of grass. Kangaroos graze heavily on grasses, so potentially we'll see a difference in grasses inside and outside. Thick-bills feed on grasses, or grass seeds, so that could have an effect. We also wanted to have a really comprehensive look at vegetation cover, so we used the Landsat satellite imagery. So for anyone who isn't aware, Landsat satellites, we can get monthly measurements of vegetation cover without even being there. These are some example photos. So basically, satellite takes photo images in the visible spectrum, so what we can see, as well as the near visible and infrared. And some people a lot smarter than me have come up with methods of unmixing that information, and we can get measurements of bare ground, photosynthetic vegetation and non-photosynthetic vegetation that's been validated and is quite reliable. And then we also got insect data when we were doing pitfall trapping for small mammals as part of another part of this project. And that would allow us to sample for a number of different species, such as grasshoppers and different locusts that came along, larvae of different beetles, tiger beetles, a lot of potential food sources for the thick-billed grasswrens. And this is what I used funding from Oakley on. I purchased a number of wide-angle cameras. So as I mentioned before, the sampling effort to sample for thick-billed grasswrens is quite incredible. Hundreds of kilometres for 10, if you're lucky. But these birds, they'll sort of scurry around the ground between these echinopods. And we sort of had the idea they kind of act, they don't fly that much, they run along the ground, they kind of act more like mammals than they do birds. So we've been setting up downwind cameras out on the plains to continuously monitor lizards, snakes, small mammals, native mice. We thought we might give it a crack and see how it goes with these guys. And it worked really well. It worked really well. So here's some photos. Some not loaded properly, that's right. Here's some example photos of the thick-billed grasswren. So we get hundreds and hundreds of these images over a few month period. So it's been a significant improvement on the sampling methods otherwise. And one of the issues that we did hit that we've overcome is that the first time we put it down, turns out that when they're facing upwards, the cameras are waterproof, but when they're facing downwards, they're not. So thankfully, the people we got them off, they very kindly fixed them up for us free of charge, and we put these little umbrellas on them, so we're not having that issue anymore. And the plan is to do statistics to basically look at whether or not we can find any direct correlations between the effect of kangaroo grazing on any of the predictor variables, trying to work out whether there's indirect effects, and yeah. One of the other issues we encountered the first time we put it out, we only had 2 experimental sites set up at that point. A fencing contractor injured himself on another job, and then when we had the issues with the rainfall, it sort of ruined our first go at collecting data for this. So the sample size at the moment, we've only had 1 sampling period. We're starting to get some interesting results, so I'll walk through. And while it's looking promising, it's also raising a few extra questions. So these are the results from our vegetation transects. And don't bother looking at all of them. I just want to highlight that we're really not actually seeing any effect on vegetation from the kangaroo grazing. This is including from exclusions that have been up for 2 years now, which is really interesting. And it's actually bucking the trend at Witchelina from other places that we're working at where kangaroo densities are a bit higher. So we thought that maybe kangaroos would be impacting, grass cover, maybe fork cover, maybe litter cover that's important for the termites and other invertebrates, but there really hasn't been any effects yet. And looking at the Landsat vegetation cover, we're actually seeing in some instances the opposite of what we expected. So throughout last year, bare soil was actually higher where kangaroos were excluded. So it's not we'd expect where there's grazing there'd be more bare soil, but none of these effects were significant. So they were essentially moving along sort of similar with a similar amount of standard error. Suggests that it might just be there's no real difference between inside and outside, and the bare soil or the photosynthetic or the non-photosynthetic cover that we're seeing yet. We are starting to see a bit of a trend in the invertebrates. So in the blue, you've got the kangaroo exclusion areas, and in the red, where kangaroos can graze, and the abundance of invertebrates we're getting in our pitfall traps is starting to increase. Would expect that potentially to become stronger as the time between being grazed, so the longer these exclusions have been up for, will increase. But the error bar suggests that might not be a statistically significant difference yet, and not sort of as large as we would have thought. What has been, as we hypothesised, is the amount of thick-billed grasswrens inside and outside the kangaroo exclusions. So again, the reds in the areas that were grazed by kangaroos, and the blues where they weren't. The metric I've used to do this is basically just the number of unique days that any given camera was visited. So it wouldn't matter whether a camera got 1 photo on a day or 50, that just counted as 1. And that's sort of just to account for the fact that there might be one cheeky little bugger coming back and checking out what's going on. But there's a number of different metrics you can use, and I've looked at them all. It's the same sort of trend where there's been significantly more thick-billed grasswrens inside the exclusions where kangaroos haven't been able to graze. What's also interesting is when I looked at the data, there's 2 exclusions that have been up for 2 years now, and 1 exclusion that's been up for about 1 year. And the majority of the thick-billed grasswren images were in the ones that have been established for longer. So it's going to be really interesting to see over time whether the exclusion that's been up for less time sort of catches up with the others. But it's still confusing because this is what we expected with the thick-billed grasswrens, but the reasons why we thought that might happen isn't really been obvious yet, or isn't going how we thought it would. There is a relationship starting to emerge between thick-billed grasswren capture rates, so that's what I've got up here on the y-axis, and the invertebrate capture rates down here on the bottom. So as you can see, this guy's an outlier. This one down at about 15 vertebrates per 100 trap nights. If we forget about that, there's a pretty clear trend emerging where as there's more invertebrates, there's significantly more images of thick-billed grasswrens. So this is an issue that we've encountered with the initial setbacks as the sample size isn't quite as high as we'd like. I imagine that if this is in fact the real effect, we'll see this emerge as we get more and more data. I'm going back out in May, so we'll double our sample size. So it's going to be really interesting to rerun the stats then and see if that's starting to emerge. But this is interesting because we've found this effect on kangaroo grazing at Witchelina, but relative to the region, kangaroo densities at Witchelina are quite low. So these are three sites I do most of my work at: Bilkamata, Fowler's Gap, Witchelina, and this is some data from our spotlighting runs. So basically we measure it by how many kangaroos we see per kilometre driven. And so the blue line, Witchelina, down at the bottom, you can see that even at its peak, it's significantly lower than the densities at Bilkamata and Fowler's Gap, which are similar properties. They receive slightly higher rainfall. They'll have slightly higher vegetation cover, so they can support more herbivores. But regardless, the numbers at Witchelina are considerably smaller. So it's interesting to see that we're seeing this really strong effect on the thick-billed grasswrens. It also contradicts some traditional thinking on how on factors that might impact thick-billed grasswrens. As I mentioned, really a strong determinant of their presence is the habitat, the kenopod shrublands, and we don't really expect grazing on kangaroos. Potentially recently, while there's been reasonably high rainfall, they're going to be focusing on eating grasses and forbs and not really touching the key habitat. So this is starting to, I guess, gives us more questions and answers, but it's a really interesting insight for us to keep pursuing to see what mechanisms it might actually be that drive their abundance. So far the cameras that I purchased with the funding from Hopefully have been a huge success, and it's a novel way of monitoring these species. And that's a method that we're going to keep developing. It's going to be really useful and hopefully really progress the research on some of these species. The really strong results that we've seen in the thick-billed grasswren capture rates inside and outside the kangaroo exclosures, they might indicate that they're extremely sensitive to any pressures, even more sensitive than we pick up in their predictor variables. And that could sort of explain how they had that really significant fall off during the last drought and even continued to decline as rainfall increased prior to that. And one of the things I'm really excited for is the potential to do something really novel with these camera traps and look at doing individual identification of the thick-billed grasswrens. So this is a photo, one of the photos that you got with the downwards cameras, and if you zoom in, you can see that the striations on the thick-billed grasswren, there's the potential that they might actually be unique to each individual. Pattern recognition is used on a number of different species. As far as I'm aware, it hasn't been used on any small birds or any birds at all, for that fact. So don't quote me, it might be a world first. And yeah, we're really looking forward to going out in March, going to collect all this data again, going to increase the replication. We're going to start to see whether some of these trends start to emerge and paint a clearer picture. But it's really important work because these are a high priority species, endangered species. And the research we're doing is going to be directly put into the conservation management plans of some of these properties and organisations. So I'd just like to, again, thank you guys for your support and all the other groups that have supported me, and happy to take any questions.
Any questions? Any questions? Scott? Sorry, Janine? Yep.
I wanted to ask you,
Just over this way a little bit. Yeah, that's it.
are there any areas in the arid zone that you have seen or aware of that have never been grazed by livestock?
That have never been grazed. There's probably not really. There is a research station in South Australia that's run by. There's a research station in South Australia that's run by, I believe, Adelaide University, and they've destocked over 100 years ago and have been doing data collection there for over 100 years. So that's a really interesting data set to see how it's changed over time. There'll be areas that are naturally not grazed based on water availability. So stock need water. It's an area where there's no permanent water source for long enough. Then that will have not been grazed simply because stuff can't live there. I mean, it might have been grazed by something really hardy like a camel if it's in the wrong area. But there'll be a few select spots, but they're few and far between.
Yeah, okay. There are areas where the soil has not been
Impacted. Yeah. Yeah, they'd be out there, but I'm not. I can give any call there. Sorry.
Okay, that works.
Cheers. Janine?
Just looking at the results you received or you've collected, was there any evidence that the feral population of other animals was also creating some kind of anomalies in your research?
So the feral herbivores that will be in the region I'm working on, could be goats. Goats could come out of the Flinders Ranges, but they generally don't make it that far into the northern Flinders Ranges. Could be horses, there could be donkeys as far as herbivores, and obviously there could be rabbits. As far as the larger ones, we do part of doing the spotlight runs to count kangaroos. It also counts these other things. And at Witchelina, we haven't seen any other large herbivore. The only other feral herbivore would be rabbits, and our fences they can move freely inside and outside. So we're working on the assumption that rabbit densities are equal between the paired treatments. We get camera trap images from. We get them on the camera traps inside and outside, so we'll be able to do a similar analysis, look at the density, so we can just rule that out that rabbits might be an issue. Yep.
Anyone? Oh, Anthony? Okay.
Is the dingo fence doing a useful job?
I mean, I guess it depends what job you're talking about. It does a really good job of keeping dingoes on one side and other things on the other. It's night and day if you look at differences either side of it. So my supervisors did some drone and satellite imagery on the other side, and they basically showed that the dune formations are different on one side to the other. So because there's been kangaroos that favour eating grasses in New South Wales, there's less grasses, there's more woody, acacias, that sort of stuff, and they hold the dunes together more. So the dunes in New South Wales or inside the dingo fence don't move as much, and they're shorter, whereas the ones on the outside move more, whereas they're not as high, but they're wider. There's differences in the species, the vegetation. So as I said, there's more grasses on the where there's dingoes and less kangaroos, because the grasses have more of a competitive advantage when there's less grazing, and then that flows on to the animals that can use those resources. So there's definitely more birds inside the dingo fence, because where the kangaroos can overgraze the grasses, there's more trees and shrubs for the birds, but then there's more small mammals on the outside, probably partly because dingoes impact cat and fox populations, but also because there's more resources such as seeds. So the dingo fence is definitely doing a job. Yeah.
A little question. Can
Yep.
you tell us a bit more about the bill brands? More information?
Sure.
Thank you.
Well, as far as science information goes, there's really not a whole heap. There's been a lot done on sort of differences between the subspecies as far as morphological and calls and genetic sort of stuff. There's been a little bit of research done on their habitat preferences. So as I said, they're really strongly tied to the blackbush in particular, but sort of canopod shrublands. Part of the challenge we've had is there hasn't actually been really anything done on their diets. There's been observations here and there of them, foraging, and I think they flipping over a rock here and there to eat bugs that are under it. There was a researcher who did a PhD on them, and she put some cameras on nests and saw what they were bringing back to their young. So that sort of informed us what we were looking at. They saw that they bring caterpillars and grasshoppers. They're really funny birds to watch because they'll run around on the ground, like I said, more like a mouse sometimes than they are a bird. And they'll pop up on the top of these blue bush, and you can hear them calling from ages away. They live in pretty small groups from my understanding, and they generally have small home ranges, as small as 4 hectares, which is really quite incredible when you look at the landscape they're living in. As you saw from that drone image I put up at the exposure we're working, as big as this landscape is, the actual suitable habitat is quite restricted. So yeah, they're a really challenging bird. I would love to put more photos up, but the reason why I don't have very many good photos of them is because they're there 1 second, and then by the time you get your camera on them, they're gone. So yeah, they're really fun, challenging birds. They're always a delight to see. We've also got song meters out there, so we're picking up their song recordings and looking at them through that way. But yeah, if you ever get the chance to go out there or look for them, I'd recommend it. Witchelina is a great spot for it.
Are they nocturnal
Well, I've got photos of them at night, so let's see if any of them come up.
or mostly nocturnal?
No, so they're mostly during the day. They go on. This is the first. So all these are obviously during the day, but then they tend to pop up now and then. And just anecdotally, haven't done any stats on this, but it always seems to be on the days at 45, 46 degrees. So I suspect they're changing their behaviour based on the heat. That's one of the things I'm really interested to see with this method. Maybe some of that decline, maybe they were changing their behaviours, maybe there's something different not accounted for. Would be a first time one of these cryptic species, we thought we knew what they were doing, and it turns out they were just hiding in plain sight in vegetation a few metres away we never thought to look in. So it's going to be really interesting as we keep going on with these camera traps that we bought with your funding to see what new information about them it brings out. Yeah, they fly, and they can definitely fly away. They'll fly from bush to bush, but for whatever reason, they like to run as well. They'll just scurry on the ground. If you can imagine this heat arrangement was a canopod shrubland. Each bush was a canopod. They'd run around from these ones, and then they might fly 20 or 30 metres to the next patch of shrubs. Yep.
All right, I think we might call time on questions, and I'd like to call on Graham Fry to give a vote. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was a fascinating talk. Really was quite inspirational in many ways. I've been out to some part of that world, not to that property, or some of those birds. They're pretty tricky things to try and find. But I think it's really fascinating what you were saying about the impact of excluding kangaroo or the dingoes, the kangaroos, and how there's still a bit doubts as to what the impact will be. So it'll be very easy to come up with simple solutions, but it's quite hard. Nature has a way of sort of going this way. So what you're doing is really terrific stuff. It's very significant research. We're very happy that we provided some partners that can assist with your research. And we're very good at getting this going. So thanks very much. It's a little
Welcome to stay around and doing some general business, or
Sure.
you want to get going.
I'll see what you guys do.
Okay, well, terrific. Thank you. Okay.